Hi, I'm Josh, recording this on November 10th, a day after we set new records here in the local area with 14 centimeters of snow, which is 5.5 inches. Climate change, man. I tell you what, I'm concerned about global warming, but I am all for local warming. So why don't you join my Patreon and help me pay my heating bill this winter so I can crank up that heat, keep nice and toasty. One thing I did purchase with my Patreon money is a book called Leonard and Hungry Paul by Rónán Hession, who is an Irish author. And this was published in 2020, and I believe this was the first novel by this particular author. I heard about it from Brian on the excellent booktube channel Bookish, or Bookish Texan. And a couple things I heard about it inspired me to pick it up. One was Brian mentioned that it is a hopeful book. And for somebody like me who lost all hope many, many years ago, to the point where, I don't know if you've seen these little rubber bracelets people wear, these that have little inspirational words on them like faith or love or whatever. Years ago I got a black one that just says despair on it. So it shows you where my mindset has been. I thought, okay, I could use some hope in my life. The other thing that got me to pick it up and read it pretty quickly was the fact that I also heard that it was about two young men who were joined in friendship over their common love of board gaming. And if you watch my channel, you know how board gaming has been my number one hobby for some decades now. Well, about 25 years probably, or close to anyways. And the first thing I do need to get out of the way, I'm going to sound like a total snobby gatekeeper, but I was quite disappointed to discover that the board games they did play and talk about in the book are your typical very old mass market games like Scrabble, Monopoly, Risk, those type of ancient games for those of us who are into the modern hobby of strategy board games. And so I was hoping for something a little more up to date in terms of that particular hobby. I mean, I'm not saying those are bad games. Scrabble is quite a fun little game and really clever anyways, but I couldn't help be a little bit disappointed by that. I will note that if I had just seen the book on the shelf, judging a book by its cover as it were, I would have thought that it looked like a very unappealing book. I really have no idea why they've put this giant fish on the cover of the book. I have no recollection of a fish being mentioned in the story here, although that's probably a fault of my poor memory. There's got to be something to do with it somewhere in the book. I don't really know, but overall it seems to, in my taste anyways, leaves a bit of an ugly, unattractive book cover that certainly doesn't look at all appealing. But fortunately I had heard good things about the book. Now, in terms of the genre that this falls into, I'm going to say that if you have been reading fantasy fiction for a while, you'll know that there have been a couple of maybe relatively recent trends within fantasy fiction, one being romantasy, or romantic fantasy, and another one has been cozy fantasy, which has also been termed low-stakes fantasy, which is something I've argued about in the past. But there have been, like with all subgenres, there have been good books and there have been not so great books within that cozy fantasy genre, but I would describe this particular book as being cozy literature, in that some might consider the plot to be low stakes, although for the people involved in the story, they wouldn't necessarily be seen that way, but it's a fairly low-key plot. It's just kind of a nice story with nice people. And yeah, it really fits that sort of casual, cozy vibe, I would say. Now, that being said, it is a very well-written book, although it's just ever so slightly on the silly side in some spots. And I'll get to that in a second, but unfortunately, it also had a few spots where I noticed some typos that should have been caught by editors, which I thought was kind of odd to have in a published book in 2020, but I guess they had slipped through the attention of the various editing processes But here's what I mean about the silliness of the book, and this starts with the very first sentence. The very first paragraph of the book says, Leonard was raised by his mother alone with cheerfully concealed difficulty, his father having died tragically during childbirth. And I immediately had to do a double take and reread the sentence to make sure it wasn't his mother that had died during childbirth. No, it was actually his father that had died during childbirth. So within this fairly serious story are these slightly absurdist, humorous bits sprinkled throughout that might feel out of place in more serious literature, but they do add to the fun of the story overall, I think. In terms of what the book is about, I don't really give much in terms of plot summaries because I don't like to spoil anything, but essentially we have two main characters, Leonard and Hungry Paul. We are never told why Hungry Paul is called Hungry Paul. I certainly don't see him eating more than the usual person in the story, and there's no real indication of where that nickname came from, but there we have it. We have these two characters, and they're both similar guys at similar stages in their life, and that they are in their 30s, in what I would guess would be the late 90s to early 2000s, based on various cultural context clues we have from the story. But these two guys are what I think society would consider to be kind of failures or even bums, maybe, in that both of them are, despite being in their early 30s, are still unmarried, living at home in their parents' houses, not doing a lot in the way of work, and just kind of skating through life, as it were. Like I mentioned, they're both real chill dudes who bond over their enjoyment of board games, and so they play board games together. And they both deal with the challenges of life that we all face as we are kind of coming of age, getting into the world, and they're each dealing with those challenges in their own way. One of the main events of the story has to do with Hungry Paul's sister, who is engaged and is about to be married. So Hungry Paul's family comes into play. His parents and his sister are also primary characters, and as his sister prepares for the wedding and then gets married, we sort of follow the family through that process. And so you can see, there's not huge events necessarily happening for our two main characters, but they're just living their lives and they're doing their best with what they've got. So I'll leave the plot summary at that, and we'll look a little bit more closely at the two characters and how I can relate to them in certain ways. The first one we'll look at is Leonard here, and Leonard was living with his mother in her home, but his mother had died shortly before the start of the story. So at this point, he was living alone in this house. And his job was, he was working as a sort of a ghost writer for another author who compiles these children's encyclopedias. And Leonard's job is to write various articles about all sorts of different historical topics and geographical topics and world topics for these children's encyclopedias, but then this other author puts his name on the books when they get published. Here's the first thing the book says about him that I could immediately relate to, going right back again to the very first page of the book, and this time in paragraph 2, it says, as sometimes happens with boys who prefer games to sports, Leonard had few friends but lots of ideas. Very, very relatable. I could also relate to what Leonard was saying about the Roman civilization, because he was writing articles about the Romans for one of his kids' encyclopedias. And so the book narrates this. Leonard's real problem, though, was that the Romans were bullies. The Romans picked on everybody for 400 years and were only eliminated when they got out-bullied themselves by the Goths and barbarians. To a kid, this is a worrying storyline. You like to think that a bully's upper hand is short-lived and his fall precipitous and permanent. The true tale of history was worryingly short of comeuppance. And it's so funny, for somebody like me who has casually studied history over the course of my entire life, I look at all these people who consider themselves historians and how excited they get about these great men of history, folks like Julius Caesar or Alexander the Great or Napoleon Bonaparte, all these guys who were more or less the Hitlers of their era, whose greed and ambition and avarice resulted in the deaths of tens of thousands of people and the great suffering of hundreds of thousands of more. And yet these are the people the historians put on the pedestals, and I feel like a lot of historians see human history as a series of great battles, from Marathon to Hastings to Waterloo to Stalingrad, whatever. And these are the epic turning points of history that people look at, instead of the really great things that have happened in history, like the human rights movements and the women's suffrage and all these things that have done really good things for humanity. So in that aspect, I definitely relate to Leonard here. Now moving on to our other character, Hungry Paul. He is living at his parents' home. If I remember correctly, his father is retired and his mother semi-retired or something like that. His sister is no longer living at home. She's living with her fiance. As far as the job goes, I think he was only working at most 1 day a week as a letter carrier for the post office. And then he was doing a little bit of volunteering with a local hospital, sitting with patients in the hospital, which his sister didn't think very much of. She really thought that it was about time that he sort of got his act together, moved out on his own. And then she also thought that her parents should sort of encourage him along so that they could really fully enjoy their retirement. And so there was this conflict, although it was mostly one-way conflict. Hungry Paul himself wasn't particularly bothered by his sister's opinions, but she was a little irritated with the situation overall. Now, at one point in the book, Hungry Paul gets offered a job to be the spokesperson for the National Mime Association, which is an extremely funny idea to begin with. The fact that the National Mime Association would need a spokesperson. But if you read the story, you'll see that Hungry Paul is the absolute perfect choice for that particular role, because when he is made to give a speech in front of a crowd, more often than not, he'll just kind of get dazzled by the situation and stand there in utter silence to everybody else's discomfort, but not his own, because he is comfortable with silence. But in order to get this position, he has to do an interview with him, and he's a little bit concerned about that, so he's speaking to his friend Leonard about it. Hungry Paul says, "The problem for the mime artist is that life is so noisy now. They are being left behind. We live in an age of cacophony, everybody talking and thinking out loud with no space or oxygen left for quiet statements and silence. In a way, it's not just about being a spokesman for the National Mime Association, but a spokesman for silence itself." Leonard replies, "What are you going to say at the interview?" "I was thinking of asking them if I could still have Mondays off so that I can keep my promises at the post office." "Will that be enough to secure the position?" "Possibly not. What kind of things do they usually ask? I've never had an interview before. I got the post office job through Dad." "In general, they usually like to know if you're a born leader, a visionary, and a can-do sort of person." "I suppose there are probably lots of things I could do if I were to try them, but generally I don't try them, so maybe I'm more of a could-don't person." I like that. He's not a can-do person, he's a could-don't person. And I really like that statement, because I really despise the fact that one of the greatest compliments we can pay to somebody in our society is that they are a hard worker. And you'll see that even in obituaries, when people are thinking about the best things they can say about this loved one who has just died, and they'll say, so-and-so was a hard worker. And I'm like, that's awful. It should be the absolute opposite. If we want to give somebody the best compliment possible, we should say they sure know how to have fun and have a good time. It's only within a capitalist system where we are only valued as worker bees who can contribute to the wealth of the people above us that being a hard worker can be considered to be a good thing. Our lives are so incredibly short, and I'm sure that nobody on their deathbed is lying there going, "Gosh, I just wish I'd worked a little bit harder, spent a bit more time at work. What a thing to spend our fleeting lives doing, toiling to build the wealth of the billionaires above us." Of course, it's easy for me to say that as somebody who's on disability, which is an embarrassing situation, once again, for somebody in a capitalist society, but that's something that was brought to mind when I read that. More of us should be could-don't people. On the topic of silence, we have this great passage as well. "Hungry Paul stared at the stippled ceiling and bathed in the quiet all around him. He tuned his ears to listen to the ever-present silence itself, rather than the bubbles of noise that floated in it. He began to appreciate its profound scale. All major spiritual and philosophical traditions throughout history had emphasized the value of silence. The universe, whether expanding or contracting, does so amidst a vast ocean of it. The Big Bang sprang from it and will one day return to it. And yet, silence, for all its ubiquity and timelessness, had found itself at odds with the clamorous nature of modern mankind. This noisy, opinionated world had made an enemy of silence. It had become something unwelcome to be broken or filled. Isn't that so true? There's really something to be said for tuning out, turning off, and being quiet. So before I get to my rating, let's talk briefly about the themes of the book, which you might have picked up a little bit just based on what I've said so far. So one big idea is this thought that our two main characters would be considered to be failures, like I said, in terms of what is valued in modern society and what society in general tends to consider to be a successful person. What's notable about these two characters is that money really means nothing to them. It's not what they value, and it's not what they pursue with their time or their energy. But because these two young men who are in their 30s aren't out there pursuing money, wealth, and independence, they are looked down on even by, like I said, their own family member, like with Hungry Paul's sister here, who really felt that he needed to step it up and make more of himself in the world. And yet he was still happy being with his parents, and his parents were happy enough to have him there too, it seems like. And when you think about it, it's so unnatural for us as humans to not be part of a big extended family, not just in terms of our relationships, but physically. For most of human history, we have grown up in these big extended families that have very much shared the same space together, if not the same exact house, at least all living in close proximity to one another and supporting one another. Whereas now it is the normal for us to go off, be independent, and not have that physical connection, so that we have this kind of intergenerational divide that comes more into play because the very young aren't interacting much with the very old, and we're physically separated from each other. So that's certainly one of the big themes of the book. And going hand in hand with that is the idea that we really shouldn't judge what other people decide to value and how other people choose to live their lives. Even if it is a family member and we think it is in their best interests that they do what we think they should do, oftentimes it might be the case where the person has found contentment and happiness in things that they value that don't make a lot of sense to most people. And so we maybe need to give other people the space to live their very brief lives as they see fit for their own happiness and contentment. So that is kind of the other hand-in-hand theme with the idea of what do we think success is and what do we think living a good life is. So very cool themes. Overall, it was a good book. It was well written. It had these very interesting, thought-provoking, and really worthwhile themes to explore. But it wasn't one of those books that kept me reading late into the night and eager to go on to the next chapter, because like I said, there wasn't a lot that was happening plot-wise. It was more of these low-key guys living their low-key lives. So it's a quiet story. It's a calm story. As I said, it's cozy literature. I would probably put my rating at, it's hard. I'm sort of stuck between 7 and 7.5 out of 10. I guess in comparison to all the great books that really knocked my socks off, I should probably put this at about a 7 out of 10 overall. It's a very good book, but it's just not super top tier for me, if that makes any sense. Hopefully based on that, you can tell if it might be a book for you or not. I would love to hear what you've been reading. I am always super interested in the books that are exciting you, especially what has really got you turning those pages in recent books. I love to hear all about it. Please do let me know, and I just really appreciate you watching. Cheers. I heard about it thanks to and I heard that it is a book that is, and a couple of things I heard, plot summaries as brief, and it's only within the universe, whether expanding or contracting, does so amidst a vast The universe, whether expanding or contracting, does so amidst a vast ocean of it. The Big Bang sprang from it and will one day return to it. God damn it. But let's jump